What if the most dangerous character in literature is not the one we hate, but the one we understand? Because by any reasonable moral standard, Heathcliff should be easy to reject. He is not presented as an ideal. He is not the kind of character people point to as a model of wisdom, courage, or virtue. And yet, generation after generation, readers continue to feel drawn toward him. Not despite his darkness, but somehow through it. That is a strange paradox. We often assume that human beings connect most deeply with goodness. We tell ourselves that we admire noble heroes, selfless leaders, and morally upright figures. But then a character like Heathcliff appears, and suddenly that assumption begins to crack. Why does someone driven by resentment feel more emotionally real than characters who are objectively better people? Why do readers trust his pain more than they trust someone else's virtue? And that question matters far beyond literature. Because Heathcliff is not simply a character. He functions more like a psychological mirror. His role inside the story is not merely to act. His role is to expose something uncomfortable about the human condition itself. He reveals what happens when rejection becomes identity. When longing becomes obsession. When emotional wounds stop being experiences and start becoming the foundation of a person's entire sense of self. But here is where the mystery begins. Most people assume Heathcliff's defining trait is revenge. Yet revenge may only be the visible surface. Beneath it lies something much older, much deeper, and far more recognizable. The feeling of being excluded. The feeling of standing outside a locked house, looking through a window at a life that seems available to everyone except you. That image matters. A locked house. Not as a building, but as a symbol. A place where belonging exists for others, but remains permanently out of reach for you. And once that feeling takes root, something dangerous can happen. The original wound begins to grow larger than the person carrying it. Over time, pain stops being something you have. Pain becomes something you are. Now the question is no longer literary. It becomes psychological. Because many people never fully heal from the experiences that shaped them. They carry old humiliations, old losses, old rejections into adulthood. The event itself may disappear, but the emotional architecture remains. Like a storm that has moved beyond the horizon while the landscape still bears its scars. And this is where Heathcliff becomes unsettlingly modern. Not because most people seek revenge, but because many people build identities around wounds they cannot release. The contradiction is profound. We usually think suffering creates empathy. Sometimes it does. But sometimes suffering creates attachment to suffering itself. Sometimes the wound becomes so central to a person's identity that healing feels like a form of loss. And if that sounds extreme, consider how often people return to the same resentment, the same heartbreak, the same story about what was taken from them. Not for weeks. Not for months. Sometimes for decades. So perhaps the real mystery of Heathcliff is not why he becomes destructive. Perhaps the real mystery is why his emotional logic feels familiar. Because if pain can become identity, then a far larger question begins to emerge. When does a wounded person stop seeking love, and start protecting the wound itself? If Heathcliff's deepest wound is rejection, then the next question becomes unavoidable: what exactly was taken from him? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. Love. Acceptance. Belonging. But that explanation is too simple. Because people survive heartbreak every day. They lose relationships, they endure disappointment, and somehow they continue forward. What makes Heathcliff different is not the existence of pain. It is the meaning he attaches to that pain. And that distinction changes everything. Human beings rarely suffer from events alone. We suffer from the stories we build around them. One person experiences rejection and concludes, "I lost something valuable." Another experiences rejection and concludes, "There must be something wrong with me." The first interpretation creates grief. The second creates identity. And once pain becomes identity, every future experience begins orbiting around the original wound. This is where Heathcliff's role becomes larger than a single literary character. He becomes an embodiment of a psychological pattern that appears everywhere, in relationships, in families, in workplaces, even in entire societies. A person who no longer sees suffering as something that happened in the past, but as proof of who they are. That creates a disturbing contradiction. The wound begins as evidence of vulnerability. Eventually it becomes a source of power. Think about that for a moment. Most people assume resentment is a weakness. Yet resentment can provide something surprisingly valuable: certainty. It offers a clear explanation for every disappointment. It turns complexity into simplicity. It gives chaos a target. And that is why letting go can feel so threatening. Because healing does not simply remove pain. Healing also removes the identity built around pain. The locked house from earlier begins to change meaning. At first, it symbolized exclusion. Now it symbolizes something else. A prison whose door may already be open. The tragedy is not always that someone is trapped outside. Sometimes the tragedy is that they no longer know how to live beyond the boundary. This is where another symbol emerges from the world of Wuthering Heights, the storm across the moors. Not a storm that arrives and passes. A storm that seems permanent. A weather system that reshapes the landscape itself. The same thing happens psychologically. Long after an emotional injury occurs, its effects continue shaping perception. New relationships become filtered through old fears. New opportunities become interpreted through old humiliations. The original event fades, but the emotional climate remains. And here the conflict becomes even deeper. Many readers assume Heathcliff is driven by love. But what if that is only partially true? What if the stronger force is not love itself, but the need to preserve the meaning created by loss? Because there is a subtle difference between wanting someone and needing the wound connected to them to remain alive. One seeks connection. The other protects identity. That distinction may explain why some forms of attachment become increasingly destructive rather than restorative. Instead of moving toward healing, they circle endlessly around the original injury, feeding it, reinforcing it, transforming it into something almost sacred. The consequence extends far beyond one individual. Families inherit emotional patterns. Children inherit unresolved fears. Entire generations can unknowingly repeat stories they never personally experienced. Trauma does not always travel through dramatic events. Sometimes it travels through assumptions, behaviors, and emotional habits that nobody questions. Which brings us to an unsettling possibility. Maybe the most dangerous wounds are not the ones that hurt the most. Maybe they are the ones that become so deeply woven into our identity that we stop recognizing them as wounds at all. And if that is true, then a new mystery emerges. What happens when a person begins defending the very thing that is destroying them? But if people can become attached to their wounds, then another question emerges. What happens when suffering stops being a private burden and starts becoming a way of interpreting reality itself? This is where the story becomes far more unsettling than a character study. Because the deepest conflict is not between one person and another. It is between two competing ways of understanding pain. Most of us are taught to think of suffering as a signal. Something that points toward a problem, a loss, or a need for healing. In that framework, pain has a purpose, but it is not meant to become a permanent home. Yet there is another possibility. Pain can become a worldview. And once that happens, every new experience begins confirming the original injury. Notice the contradiction. The more a person believes they are protecting themselves from future harm, the more they become controlled by past harm. What feels like strength becomes dependence. What feels like certainty becomes imprisonment. This is why Heathcliff's influence reaches beyond his own emotional life. He represents a pattern that appears whenever a person begins organizing their identity around grievance. The original wound may have been real. The suffering may have been genuine. But over time, something changes. The wound stops being a memory. It becomes a lens. And a lens does not merely show reality. It reshapes reality. This is the crisis hidden beneath the surface. Because once pain becomes the primary lens, even love itself begins to transform. Not necessarily into hatred. Something more complicated. Love becomes evidence. Proof of what was lost. Proof of what should have been. Proof of what the world failed to provide. And suddenly the goal is no longer connection. The goal becomes preserving the meaning attached to the loss. This is where many readers encounter an uncomfortable recognition. Human beings often believe they are chasing happiness. In reality, they are sometimes chasing coherence. A painful story that explains everything can feel safer than an uncertain future that explains nothing. Think about the ghost at the window. Not as a supernatural image. As a psychological one. A memory standing outside the present moment, demanding to be let back in. The reason this image remains powerful is that almost everyone carries some version of it. An old humiliation. An old regret. An old rejection. Something that continues knocking long after the event itself has ended. The question is not whether the ghost exists. The question is who keeps opening the window. And now the scale begins to expand. What happens to a family when unresolved pain becomes inherited truth? What happens to a community when resentment becomes identity? What happens to a society when entire groups define themselves primarily through historical wounds? Suddenly we are no longer discussing one character. We are discussing civilizations. History is filled with examples of people preserving old injuries for generations. Sometimes this preservation protects memory. Sometimes it protects justice. But sometimes it traps entire communities inside emotional cycles they can no longer see. The same psychological mechanism that operates within an individual can operate within a culture. That is the escalation hidden inside the story. A wounded person can spread pain. A wounded family can spread patterns. A wounded society can spread narratives. And every level believes it is simply defending itself. This leads to perhaps the most disturbing contradiction so far. The people who appear most devoted to the past are not always protecting memory. Sometimes they are protecting identity. Because if the wound disappears, then the question becomes unavoidable: who are we without it? And that question brings us to a revelation that is still only partially visible. Perhaps the real danger is not that suffering changes people. Perhaps the real danger is that suffering can become so deeply intertwined with meaning that a person begins to fear healing more than pain itself. But if that is true, then we have not yet reached the deepest layer of the mystery. Because why would anyone choose a wound over freedom? What if the answer is not that people choose pain over freedom? What if, at a certain point, they can no longer tell the difference between the two? This is where the deeper revelation begins to emerge. The central force operating beneath Heathcliff is not merely grief, resentment, or even longing. It is fusion. The collapse of the boundary between self and desire. Most healthy forms of love contain a hidden assumption: two people remain separate. They connect, influence one another, even transform one another, but they remain distinct individuals. The psychological world surrounding Heathcliff operates according to a completely different logic. Separation itself becomes intolerable. Not because connection is valuable, but because identity has become dependent on connection. And that distinction reveals something profound. The greatest fear is no longer rejection. The greatest fear is fragmentation. The possibility that the self might be incomplete on its own. Suddenly many of the symbols surrounding this world begin to take on a different meaning. Consider the windswept moors. They are not merely a landscape. They represent a space without clear boundaries. A place where one thing blends into another. Earth and sky. Storm and silence. Freedom and isolation. The same symbolic pattern appears psychologically. The lines between love and possession begin to blur. The lines between memory and reality begin to blur. The lines between self and other begin to blur. And once boundaries disappear, another consequence emerges. Every threat feels existential. A disagreement is no longer a disagreement. It becomes abandonment. A loss is no longer a loss. It becomes annihilation. This is why the emotional intensity surrounding Heathcliff feels so different from ordinary heartbreak. The conflict is operating at the level of identity itself. The question is not, how do I live without what I lost? The question becomes, who am I if what I lost is gone? That shift changes everything. Because human beings can survive enormous suffering. What they struggle to survive is the collapse of meaning. And meaning is precisely what is at stake here. The locked house, the storm, the ghost at the window. These are not separate images. They form a single psychological architecture. A house that cannot be entered. A storm that never fully ends. A presence that refuses to disappear. Together they represent a consciousness trap between reality and attachment. Between the present and an imagined past. Between life as it is and life as it should have been. Now the scale expands again. Entire cultures often build themselves around similar structures. Golden ages that must be restored. Historical wounds that must never be forgotten. Lost identities that must somehow be recovered. The pattern repeats because it emerges from something fundamentally human. We do not merely seek meaning. We seek permanence. We want certain people, certain moments, certain versions of ourselves to remain untouched by time. But reality offers no such bargain. Everything changes. Everything moves. Everything transforms. And this leads to a revelation far more unsettling than the question of revenge or suffering. Perhaps the deepest tragedy is not that some people cannot let go. Perhaps the deepest tragedy is that they mistake permanence for love. They confuse preservation with devotion. They believe that refusing to release the past is proof of loyalty to it. But what if that belief contains a hidden error? What if the thing that appears to be love is actually resistance to reality itself? And if that possibility is true, then an even larger mystery begins to appear. What if the most destructive force in this story is not hatred, resentment, or loss, but the refusal to accept that every form of love must eventually learn how to change? But what if the central tragedy has never been about losing someone, preserving the past, or resisting change? What if all of those are merely symptoms of something deeper? This is the point where the entire structure comes into focus. The deepest revelation hidden within Heathcliff is not that trauma creates suffering. That idea is already familiar. Nor is it that rejection can shape a life. Most people already understand that. The real revelation is far more uncomfortable. It is that human beings often confuse intensity with truth. And once that confusion takes hold, an entire life can be built upon it. This is the hidden logic that connects every layer we have explored. The storm on the moors. The locked house. The ghost at the window. The refusal to release what has been lost. They all point toward the same psychological pattern. The belief that the strongest feeling must be the most authentic feeling. That the deepest pain must reveal the deepest truth. That what hurts the most must matter the most. But that assumption contains a dangerous flaw. Intensity measures emotional force. It does not measure reality. Yet people repeatedly mistake one for the other. Consider how often human beings trust their strongest emotions over evidence, reflection, or growth. A powerful grievance feels more convincing than a quiet insight. Obsession feels more meaningful than acceptance. Emotional extremes create the illusion of certainty. And certainty is seductive because it eliminates ambiguity. This is why Heathcliff remains such a powerful figure. His role is not simply to represent suffering. His role is to expose the temptation hidden within suffering. The temptation to believe that pain grants authority. That wounds grant wisdom. That emotional intensity grants moral legitimacy. But the novel quietly dismantles that assumption. Not through argument, but through consequence. Because the deeper one organizes life around emotional intensity, the smaller reality becomes. The world begins revolving around a single injury, a single absence, a single unresolved need. everything else gradually loses significance. This is where the core conflict finally reveals itself. The struggle is not between love and hatred. It is not between loyalty and betrayal. It is not even between memory and forgetting. The true conflict is between attachment and reality. One force demands that the world remain faithful to an emotional truth from the past. The other insists that reality continues moving regardless of what we feel. And reality always wins. That is the philosophical center of the story. Not because reality is cruel, but because reality is indifferent. It keeps changing whether we are ready or not. It keeps moving whether we accept it or not. The consequence reaches far beyond one literary figure. Entire ideologies can emerge from wounded identities. Entire communities can become organized around emotional narratives that once served a purpose but eventually become prisons. Entire lives can become dedicated to protecting meanings that no longer help the people carrying them. This is why the story continues to resonate nearly 2 centuries later. It is not describing a rare psychological condition. It is revealing a universal human temptation. The temptation to make our strongest emotions the foundation of our identity. And that leads to the deepest insight of all. Perhaps what makes someone fully human is not the intensity of their suffering. Perhaps it is their ability to transform suffering into wisdom rather than identity. Because if pain becomes who we are, then every wound demands preservation. But if pain becomes something we learn from, then the wound no longer controls the future. And that raises a consequence larger than any individual character. If people, families, and even civilizations build themselves around emotional injuries, what kind of legacy do they leave behind when the wound becomes more important than reality itself? Once a wound becomes identity, the consequences do not end with the person carrying it. They continue moving outward, often in ways that are difficult to see. This is the legacy hidden beneath the surface. Not a legacy of events, but a legacy of patterns. Heathcliff's significance does not come from what he experiences. It comes from what he reveals. He exposes how unresolved suffering can become a force that reshapes relationships, perceptions, and even entire emotional environments. The cost is rarely immediate. That is what makes it so dangerous. The deepest consequences emerge slowly. They appear in the assumptions people inherit, the fears they normalize, and the emotional habits they mistake for personality. Consider the image that has followed us throughout this journey, the ghost at the window. At first it seemed like a symbol of memory. Then it became a symbol of attachment. Now it reveals something else. It represents the persistence of unfinished meaning. Not a person refusing to leave the past, but a past that continues demanding interpretation. Human beings are meaning-making creatures. We can endure extraordinary hardship if we believe it serves a purpose. What becomes destructive is not suffering itself. It is the inability to transform suffering into wisdom. When that transformation fails, pain does not disappear. It circulates. It moves from one relationship to another. From one generation to the next. From one story to another. This is why the legacy of emotional wounds often feels larger than the original wound itself. A single rejection can eventually shape an entire worldview. A worldview can shape a family. A family can shape a culture. And a culture can shape history. The scale shift is remarkable. What begins as a private experience can evolve into a collective inheritance. This pattern appears everywhere. In communities defined by old grievances. In institutions built around historical fears. In individuals who continue fighting battles that ended years ago. The specific details change, but the underlying structure remains the same. An old wound becomes a source of identity. Identity becomes a source of meaning. Meaning becomes something that must be defended. And eventually the defense becomes more important than growth. That is the hidden consequence. Not merely suffering, but stagnation. The inability to evolve because evolution threatens the story that explains who we are. This is why the locked house remains such a powerful memory fragment. Earlier it represented exclusion. Later it represented self-imposed confinement. Now it represents inheritance. Each generation receives keys from the previous one, often without realizing it. Some keys open doors. Others lock them. The question is whether we recognize the difference. And this is where Heathcliff's legacy becomes unexpectedly relevant to modern life. The character survives because the psychological pattern survives. Every era creates new forms of attachment to pain. New ways of building identity around loss, outrage, resentment, or nostalgia. The symbols change. The mechanism does not. What makes this legacy so enduring is that it feels meaningful. It feels righteous. It feels justified. And sometimes it is. But justification does not eliminate consequence. A wound can be understandable and still become destructive. A grievance can be legitimate and still become limiting. A memory can be sacred and still prevent growth. That is the paradox the story leaves behind. The very experiences that help us understand ourselves can eventually prevent us from becoming someone new. And perhaps that leads us to the final unresolved mystery. If every human being carries emotional scars, and if those scars inevitably shape identity to some degree, then where is the line between honoring a wound and living inside it? And how do we know when memory has stopped teaching us and started controlling us? Perhaps that is why this story continues to feel alive long after its final page. Not because it provides answers, but because it refuses to let us escape certain questions about ourselves. The lasting significance of Heathcliff is not that he represents an extreme case. It is that he reveals a possibility that exists, in smaller forms, within almost every human life. The possibility that what begins as a wound can gradually become a worldview. The possibility that what begins as loss can become identity. And the possibility that what feels most meaningful is not always what helps us grow. In the end, the most powerful image is not the storm, the ghost, or even the locked house. It is the space between them. A landscape suspended between memory and reality. Between attachment and transformation. Between the person we were and the person we might become. That is where the story truly lives. Not in a particular place or time, but in a universal human tension. Every life contains moments that leave a mark. Certain memories refuse to fade. Certain losses continue shaping how we see the world. We carry them forward because they matter. Because they helped create the people we are. But there is a quiet difference between carrying a memory and being carried by it. That distinction may be the deepest lesson hidden beneath everything we have explored. The goal of human growth is not to erase the past. It is not to pretend that pain never happened. It is not to abandon the people, experiences, or dreams that once defined us. The challenge is something much more difficult. To allow those experiences to become part of our story without allowing them to become the entire story. This is where the character's legacy becomes larger than literature. He stands as a reminder that emotional truth and ultimate truth are not always the same thing. A feeling can be real without being a reliable guide. A wound can be meaningful without becoming sacred. A memory can deserve respect without demanding obedience. And perhaps that is why the symbols endure. The storm reminds us that emotions are powerful but temporary. The locked house reminds us that barriers are not always where we think they are. The ghost at the window reminds us that the past remains present only as long as something within us continues answering its call. These images survive because they point toward a reality that extends far beyond one character. They point toward the ongoing human struggle to balance remembrance with renewal. To honor what shaped us without becoming trapped by it. To love what was without losing what still might be. And maybe that is the final insight. The opposite of suffering is not happiness. The opposite of suffering is not forgetting. The opposite of suffering may be movement. The willingness to allow life to continue unfolding even when part of us wishes to remain standing in an earlier chapter. Because every person eventually faces the same choice. Not whether they will experience loss, disappointment, or heartbreak. Those things belong to the human condition. The real question is what happens afterward. Do we build a home inside the wound? Or do we carry its lessons forward into a future it was never meant to control? And perhaps the most important mystery is not why some people cannot let go of the past. Perhaps the deeper mystery is whether becoming fully human requires learning that love is not proven by how tightly we hold on, but by whether we can allow what mattered to change us without allowing it to define us forever.